Sound, music, sustainability. Welcome to Sustain FM. In the 1950s, Charles Keeling started measuring carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere at the Moana Loa Observatory in Hawaii. These measurements showed for the first time how the planet itself is breathing, as forests in the northern hemisphere grow leaves in the spring, absorbing CO2, then releasing it back into the atmosphere in the fall when leaves drop off the trees. Today we'll be talking about Can You Hear the Earth Breathing?, a composition and performance that translates this climate data into sound that brings to life these sustainability cycles and the natural and unnatural systems that lie beneath the production and absorption of carbon dioxide. The performance includes both sonified data representing CO2 concentration, along with field recordings, modular synthesizers, samplers, biofeedback pads connected to plants, effects pedals, and looping feedback. We'll talk with Lisa Canola, the data artist on the project, as well as Erbse, a movement artist I've collaborated with on a few performances now. So let's get into it. All right, welcome, Lisa. Thanks for joining today. I really appreciate that. So maybe to get started, you're listed as data artist on Can You Hear the Earth Breathing? And before we get into the artist part, can you talk a little bit about the data side? What's your background with data and coding?
Hi, Steve. Yes, I'm happy to talk about that. But first of all, thanks for having me. Glad to be here. Regarding my background, I have a formal degree in computer science. So I worked in software development for more than 6 years, mostly as an engineer or product manager, and particularly in the field of machine learning. And in machine learning, it is very often required that you work or process large amounts of data of all kind of form to train machine learning models. And in that regard, I did a lot of data analysis and related work in my professional career. I had no touch points, though, with processing audio data so far. But as music has been a passion ever since, it was really great to dive deeper into the technical aspect of music production and see what is possible at the intersection of the two domains. So it was a really great experience to use my professional knowledge, I would say, in a creative way, especially in the context of sustainability.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so you already had that background on working with data, and for the Earth Breathing project, we had sort of the big idea of translating climate data into sound, but of course that's easier said than done. And I'm curious, as we started sort of talking about this, what were some of the first things you thought about in the translation or sonification process, whether it was libraries to use or where to get the data or even just getting started? I'm curious, what were some of the first things that you were thinking about?
So when we talked about like CO2 emission and also about music, that's basically how the two of us connected. My thought was like, music and MIDI in the end is data. And we have this CO2 emission data from the past 100 to even 800,000 years back. So both is data. So is there a way to translate the one into the other? And then can we manage this? I felt very challenged by that. So the first step was looking in what the MIDI data format basically is. Is it human readable by itself? Is it easily writable? Of course, you can put it into your DAW and see the different note values. But if we want to do this project, we didn't want to do that one by hand, of course. So is there a way to translate it into something which is easily writable, hopefully also by a programming language like Python, which is very often used for data processing. So that was the first step. And I found an open source library, which made it possible to translate from the MIDI file to CSV and back. So the first trial basically was to take a sample file and see if I can write it out in CSV, then MIDI, and listen how that sounds in a DAW, in our case, Ableton. And I remember it was a pretty awesome moment when I translated the first file and got sound out of it. Although, of course, like especially with the CO2 data, it sounded very scary at first. So this were the main considerations.
Interesting. So that's interesting that you said it sounded scary at first. And for people that may not be familiar, like what was that initial sound? You talked about putting the MIDI into a DAW and working with that in Ableton. So what were the value, like what was actually making the sound in that first test that you did?
So I remember I first took the data from the last 100 years. That was also the one that you showed me first or introduced me to, and it has this interesting seesaw curve. And I mean, that's also how we kind of got to the idea of earth breathing. Like, so you can imagine it very much like a ringing sound, which slowly but steadily and scarily gets higher and higher and higher. That was pretty much the sound.
Okay, so the note values are getting higher and higher as the
Yes.
CO2 level is getting higher and higher. Okay.
Exactly.
All right. So that's actually a good segue into the next question that I had, because once you had the data and once you figured out that process of the coding and the translation, and you had the libraries and from CSV to MIDI and back again, that wasn't really the end of the process, right? I mean, how did you think about approaching things like scaling the data values from different data sets? Or you mentioned that the data goes back 800,000 years, so we were dealing with different time series that had different data points. So how did you kind of think about putting those, because I guess those files were actually quite different, right, in terms of the high value, the low value, the time series, how often the data points were. I'm just curious how you approach that part.
Yeah, it is also all very, very valid and interesting points. And remember, we had a lot of back and forth there, which I found very interesting, and also learned a lot about music there, or you teach me a lot about music here. So yeah, you're right. There were different challenges, especially on the different time scales that you look at. For example, for the last 100 years, as the measures have very regular data points, it was a bit easier. So we could have very reliable data. There were barely any missing values. They were all very well formatted. But the more you go back, for example, taking a curve or like data points from today back to the last 2,000 years or the last 10,000 or even the last 800,000 years, data, of course, wasn't measured day by day, but calculated. So it came in a somewhat different format, but also with more missing values, of course, which had to be cleaned out, which is a very normal thing you do in data engineering or processing. So that was, of course, one part, like the quality of the data that you get in. But getting to the more music-related part of it, of course, as we wanted to make a performance, I first had to understand, okay, like what note values can be represented in MIDI, what other information could be enclosed in the MIDI format, and also what range of notes or tones basically we want to operate in. So if you perform the set, the different data sets would kind of be distinguishable or in relation to each other. So we first had to, or I have first had to see what note values are available and how I want to translate the different MIDI or like the different CO2 emission values into that. And I think there also like the actual creative process started when the two of us had conversations about, okay, do we actually, for example, want it to sound a little bit scary as the curve goes up and up and up, because that's unfortunately basically how it is, or do we want them to be in the roughly same range, or do we want to play with other things like velocity and things like that? I hope that answered the question somewhat. If there's another point I shall talk about, please let me know.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, and it was quite interesting. So yeah, working in that process. So once we figured those parts out, then effectively I got, I think it was like 6 or 7 different MIDI files representing those different time series. And then I was able to play those back into my modular synthesizers and both pre-recorded and sample that and also play that live. And that's a good transition, I guess, into kind of the second part I wanted to talk about, because so far we've talked a lot about translation. So how do we translate those data values into sound? But as you mentioned about it being scary, I guess the other part is really around what we called disclosure or transparency. How do we make visible or audible to the audience those kind of choices? Because, of course, we could take those data sets and play them back very slow through a nice piano sound and make climate change sound kind of chilled out and slow and happy. Or we could make it fast and played back through a metallic, distorted synthesizer, make it kind of sound scary and angry. And we talked a little bit about we did some printouts, so we actually told people, had some written information for the audience, but then we also had a video playing in the background where we had videos of climate change, and you cut together some pieces and added some screenshots, I think. Can you talk a little bit about how you thought that might help the audience understand what was going on and what kind of things we wanted to show the audience?
I think the beauty of that project also was to show, for example, how the CO2 emission over a year and then over like 10 years and such, like this typical seesaw curve, is influenced by the trees losing their leaves in the northern hemisphere. I found that like a insanely beautiful way to illustrate that, and then even underline it with sound. So that's why it was very important for me to give this little hint, like showing the curve and laying like trees in their different seasons over the year under it, so people could somewhat relate at least to this kind of ringing sound. And I found it like really great that you additionally put it like field recordings or different kind of videos or pictures from industrial scenes or from nature scenes to it. I think on top of the audio, having this visual cues can even strengthen the whole message.
So that's very interesting. I mean, this is one of the things that I'm really fascinated by, sort of picking up what you just said there around strengthening the message, because I think it's always a bit of a balance or maybe even a dance between, I mean, if we think of sort of one end of the spectrum where everything is like really, really obvious and really, really laid out to people, and it's sort of, it's almost like a lecture. And then at the other end of the spectrum, everything is kind of really interesting and musical, but kind of buried, and people may not have any idea kind of what's going on or what they're listening to. And I think it's quite interesting sort of moving along that spectrum, because I think I agree with you. It is nice to give people that information on what they're hearing, but it's sometimes a delicate balance, or if we go too far with that, it kind of feels like people are attending an academic lecture instead of actually being at a performance. I'm curious your thoughts on sort of navigating that balance or sort of moving along that spectrum with what kind of information is presented to the audience.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely correct here. And I think that was like a topic that we talked about very, very long in our process, or I had a lot of discussions about, and you're correct. It's like a very delicate balance between being like very, I would say, in your face, and having a musical performance. So having like navigating on the edge, at least giving hints on what is presented to them, but as you say, it not making it like a scientific lecture is kind of important. So I think, yeah, you're right. We thought about giving a handout or something like this. But I think overall we did a quite nice balance here. If I would be the audience, so I always try to put myself into the position of the audience. Mm-hmm. I would like to at least know what I'm hearing to kind of relate to it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But of course, I think you very often also reminded me to then, okay, we also don't want it to be even distracting or taking the attention away from the musical performance, which I mean was still in the end the main target.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's and so I think one of the things that was interesting through the performances and the evolution in the first iteration, we had that video and that sort of background information playing in the background on the screen during the performance. And then in a different performance, we had pretty much the same video, but playing on a loop for 30 minutes silently before the performance started, to kind of give people a bit of an insight and give people a bit of a hint on what they were going to hear, but then not having that video during the performance, so they were more focused on the actual performance element itself. And I think there might be even other ways to experiment with, yeah, like you said, giving people enough information that they know what's going on, they have a deeper connection to the sounds, but not distracting from the actual performance itself. So yeah, this might be some interesting things to explore there in the future.
Yeah, and now as you say it, like I was just thinking about it again. I think what was very powerful was giving strong visuals of nature, but not being too much in your face about all the data background, because that can also be somewhat distracting. I mean, good to know, good to show them, okay, we're actually using data that is transformed into music here, but that's not what we want to tell the audience. Like, I think the most powerful things were like visuals of nature and trees, and yeah, small hint of curves.
Right. Okay. Great. Well, yeah, so thanks for that background on earth breathing. And so far, that's been performed a few times in Berlin and in Trondheim, Norway, and in Amsterdam and Utrecht, with I guess what I call static data, in terms of data that we downloaded and then you processed and played back in MIDI. And just before we wrap up, I'm curious, what are the kind of things that interest you in future collaborations, thinking about data and music together? Is it around looking at other kinds of data, or maybe accessing live data, or maybe other things, or different ways of processing? And I'm curious, what are the kind of things that interest and excite you about continuing to work with the data and sound and sustainability together?
Yeah, like wide topic. I mean, we had another kind of smaller, similar project where we did not only use CO2 data, but other data sources, which I really enjoyed, because I think we got even a bit more musically creative. For example, using data about rainfall or dust and things like that, which you can interestingly translate into music. So that was and is already very interesting. For the future, I think, as I'm also like learning more and more about music production and live performing, I think not only, as you said it, not only using this kind of two-step process, preparing data before and then using it in a performance. I think live data would be a really interesting next step. Also, or mostly because it could foster an even stronger connection to the audience. A little bit similar, like what you do sometimes with plants. But we could, for example, take other sources that have a direct connection to the audience in the moment, which could be interesting. But also other ways to perform. I mean, so far I only worked before the performance, but actually having more live performance focused work, like either live coding or being more active in the visuals in the moment live.
For people that aren't familiar, you mentioned the term live coding. Can you talk a little bit about what live coding means for people that might not know what that is?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So there are different frameworks for which you can use, like literally code that you otherwise would use for producing software programs to produce sound. I mean, kind of similar to what we did with MIDI, but a bit more targeted. Like there are frameworks which are a bit more targeted for live music performances. Because as we said, in the end, sound also boils down to data, like note values that you have on a note sheet. So there are ways to procedurally or in the moment use coding for producing actually very nice sounding sounds.
Cool. That sounds great. Yeah, that's something I'm really curious to play with and explore in the future. All right. Well, thanks very much for taking the time to chat, Lisa. I really appreciate that. Look forward to what comes next in collaborations around sound, data, and sustainability.
Thank you, Steve. It was a really nice conversation. I'm looking forward to more collaborations.
Great. Sounds great. Talk to you soon. So let's listen to a little bit of the performance. You can hear the sound of the data that Lisa was talking about there. This is an excerpt from a performance in Berlin at Akud Maknoy in 2022. So here we go. Very happy to have Erbse here, active in the fields of visual arts, music, dance, and philosophy. Is queer feminist, learning, exploring, and experimenting. A cornerstone in Erbse's work is researching power relations and fixed labels, that demarcation through categories and Anthropocene perspectives. At the same time, Erbse is attempting to create interconnectivity and a blurring of boundaries as resistances. So thanks very much for being here. Very happy to have you and have a chat.
Thank you, Steve.
You're welcome. So maybe before we kind of dive into talking about Can You Hear the Earth Breathing, one of the things I'm kind of most curious about, I've heard you use this phrase a few times, decentering the human. And I think that's kind of an interesting phrase in and of itself, but also given that you're often performing as a movement artist and that you are very visibly human, I'm very curious, how does that actually work? Like, what does decentering the human in performance mean to you?
I mean, so first of all, like decentering the human is not something that comes from nowhere. You know, I read it in a lot of like approaches from new materialism, which I might explain later, maybe. But in our case, I mean, I use this phrase especially in our performance case because what we did, or what I like that we did, was we created that room. And this is like a crucial or a cornerstone in my work that I do, like organizing how we perceive, how we live, and how we plan rooms. And we planned or organized this room with a lot of actors, which is you, me, the music, and plants. And decentering the human, I mean, in another big phrase, it could mean, you know, get rid of an anthropocentric perspective, which is just another big phrase. But for me, it's very important or crucial on what path I can approach this. And my path, or like my vision, so to say, is to try to shift my perception. And shifting the perception is, or comes with like, first of all, this room creation. Second of all, like acknowledging that there are always several actors who build a room or build a world. For example, like me, you, music, and plants.
Like the world of the performance, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
In this case, yeah. But also like the real world, so to say. Another aspect that I like to introduce is like focusing on, for example, the agency of materiality. And this is where we come to new materialism, because I like follow the author Jane Bennett, who say that every materiality has an effect and therefore agency, which also like is contributing to the world building or room building, so to say. Yeah. So these are the points where I say I'm trying to focus on shifting thinking patterns, so to say. And in our case, in this performance, I would say it's also some sort of play, actually, because for this 30 minutes or so, I dive into another world with you and also with plants. And there I can play with them. I can communicate in a different way with them, even like bodily or with embodiment, to come in like unusual or unremarkable positions that I usually don't have. And I think in this case, this means decentering the human. In other cases or in other examples of like normal like daily living or something, it could be something else. But in this case, I think it's focusing on materiality and also perception. Yeah.
So that's very interesting, especially when you mentioned about the plants, and you talked about play. That's actually kind of a nice segue into the next question that I had. So thinking a bit more deeply about that performance, I'm curious, this maybe tension is not the right word, but maybe balance between intention and play. So you talked about the different actors and the agency. So I'm curious, what was your intention in terms of the interaction between the breath and the body and the plants, and how much of that was things that you were thinking about in advance? How much was kind of in the moment? How did that kind of evolve? So not so much, I guess, thinking a little bit more about during that 30 minutes, what was kind of your intention going in, and how did that morph and change and evolve during the performance?
I mean, what is crucial to this piece is that it is based on improvisation. And I think this is a very important moment because, you know, what I also try to question is, like, why are systems sometimes so static? And now I'm this approach comes from like Western thinking, like to have static systems, static categories. And my biggest question is, how and where can we improvise in those static systems? And I think this 30 minutes zone that I'm like zoning in is a way of, as I said, add new thinking patterns, and therefore new patterns of like moving around without thinking, without having fixed categories. So I think nothing is really intentional, but all the movement is based on our conversations that we had about the topic. Because with our conversations that we had before, I had this safety, I had this, you are there, we are like kind of creating a safer room for us. And this is the only thing that is intentional, you know, like all the stuff that we talked about before. But like in the moment, I'm just getting into this zone because of this safety feeling that we created. Also, like regarding the room building, what I talked before. And I think, you know, you could ask me directly after the performance, what did you do? I could say, I don't know. Because
it's that so much in the moment.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And this is intentional, you know, this is what I want, because when I plan doing this, I'm not like this concentrated. Right. Even if it's paradoxical, but it's this concentration to not plan.
Right.
More or less.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's fascinating. And so maybe for people that weren't actually at the performance, you talked about some of the actors, and maybe could you talk a little bit about what were some of the physical activities? Because you had your breath, and there was a microphone, and there were some pads and the plants. So maybe for people that weren't there, could you describe a couple of the physical acts that you were actually doing?
Yeah. So what is important to say is that we like rearranged this performance, so it's not the same every time. But we have several components. We have the microphone as a necklace. So sometimes I make tones or even sing. For example, in our first performance, we didn't want to have words or language in it. In our second performance, we wanted to have this because there I added, for example, some of my like eco-somatic exercises that I developed with a good friend of mine. And there we had the topic vulnerability, for example, between actors or in rooms between actors or relationscapes. So we have the microphone, and sometimes I make tones or even sing or speak. Then I have my body, which I like to move around and away and close from plants, and also rearrange like my body position and the position of plants in the room to have this like relationscape dynamic that is changing constantly. And then we have these pads that I put on myself, or the plants. And I think you can maybe explain what the pads do better than I can, so feel free to explain it.
Sure. So so the pads that Erbse is referring to, they were actually originally developed for physical therapy. So if you have a damaged muscle, the pads can go on your skin and will measure the electrical resistance going through the muscle. So doctors can tell, is the muscle healing properly? And then a modular synth developer developed a module that has the same pads and detects the electrical resistance when the pads are on skin or the pads are on plants, and that generates voltage and gates in the modular synth. So the simplest way is that a high voltage is a high pitch and a low voltage is a low pitch, and triggering sounds. So the pads that Erbse was describing would literally play the synthesizer. And I think from the first performance, that was one of the things I found most fascinating, where at one of the elements, it almost felt like almost like a duet or a trio, because at one point you had put the pads on the plant, so the plant was generating voltage and producing sounds, and at the same time you were actually physically touching and stroking the plant that was changing the sounds, and you were vocalizing, kind of harmonizing, but not quite in response. So it was this really interesting kind of feedback loop of, in one sense, completely independent actors, but actually very intertwined with these feedback loops that were connected. It was amazing.
I mean, we've been in this circle, so to say. Yeah, and this is, I think so. I talked a lot about like room building or world building, and this could also be a little bit abstract, but actually in this case, it's this that we can see, that we can feel, that maybe the audience can also feel or see or hear, whatever. Like, what I like about this performance is that it touches so many like senses, like ears, eyes, or maybe touch. Because I mean, this is something for the future, but we also plan to like involve the audience more and more. I mean, at our first performance, I was like involving the audience by like dancing close to the plants, but also dancing close to the audience, as if they were like there is no hierarchy between plants and human. And this is how I like interacted with them, or I just sat in there in the crowd, listening to the plants, listening to you. So the soundscape is also like, we are all like embedded in this soundscape, which is also very nice.
Yeah, I love that phrase, embedded in the soundscape. And maybe that kind of brings up one of the things. Okay, so there's a million things I want to ask about, but I'll try and focus on. So one in particular, when you talked about the senses and the audience engagement and sort of what the audience may be feeling. So I'm curious, maybe for yourself as an artist, but also in particular with this performance, what were your thoughts on how important it was that the audience kind of understood what we were trying to get across, or was it more about them experiencing something, or I'm not quite sure, but I'm curious your thoughts on sort of that tension, that balance, and how you approach that.
Yeah, this is a very important topic. And also, this was actually one of the reasons why I suggested that we are not using words in the first performance, because my goal was actually, so there are two perspectives that you could see what I say. One perspective is I actually don't care what the audience understands, in terms of this is not my goal to make a direct message. On the other hand, you could say, or I say, like my goal is to create this room and create this atmosphere with all these actors, and to really be in this zone, like really into, makes them feel something similar. Like just this energy, like goes also to them. Like this is the goal. But I'm not doing this for them, you know. I'm not doing this direct messaging into the audience. It's just that I hope in the end, I hope that there's some kind of transportation through my or through our, like, atmosphere building.
And I want to pick up, you said that you hope they feel something similar. Do you mean that the feeling, I like when you're talking about creating this room, that feeling or the sensations or the emotion or the experience, that the audience then sort of picks up on that and has a kind of a shared experience? Is that kind of what you're...
Yeah, kind of. I mean, for example, at our first performance, I also had the picture for me, to make it easier for me, to have the picture of a creature that crawls around the plants and with those like effects on my voice and all that stuff. And I could really be like becoming something else.
Right.
And I tried to embody this. And I hoped that the audience could feel this, like shifting my behavior, shifting my presence, shifting something, to not also to maybe like decenter my human appearance, but also to like decenter the hierarchies between, for example, seeing human as subject and plant as an object, which is like completely like false.
Right. That separation of humans and nature.
Yeah. I try to embody this. I try to embody that. I think this is just not enough to separate in subject and object. Yeah. And this is what I try to not let them feel, because as I said, I don't do this like for them, but I hope that more or less like our room that we create transport this. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. So maybe coming back, a couple of minutes ago, you talked about in our most recent performance, the reading and the echosomatic practices, which to me was quite interesting because we talked a little bit about it, but for myself, I almost kind of deliberately chose not to go too deeply into it before the performance, because for me it was interesting to actually almost share the experience of the audience, kind of hearing it for the first time. And so maybe can you talk a little bit more about what the intention be, or maybe actually to start, what does echosomatic mean? Like, what's that kind of term referring to?
Yeah, I also explored this term this year in Floating University at some workshops, and I think there are several definitions, but my definition, like first of all, the word consists of like eco from ecology and soma from like somatics. And for me, these are exercises to get to those different thinking patterns, to perceive differently, to concentrate on different things that you usually not concentrate on, or even bodily to get into new perspectives, for example, like just different angles to approach another being or something like this. And this is, like for me, this is like not it. So doing exercises and then you're like a better human or something? No, but for me, this is the starting point of creating those different rooms that I talked about. Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
So maybe to wrap up, as you've mentioned a couple times, we've done a few different iterations of the performance, and there have been some elements that have stayed the same and some that have changed. We've added new pieces, taken some things out. We've sort of talked about different approaches to movement and engaging the audience. I'm curious, what are your thoughts about where you see the piece going in the future, or different things can be added? We've talked about body sounds, we've talked about engaging the audience, performing in different kinds of spaces. I'm curious about kind of what gets you excited. What are the kind of things you'd like to explore in future versions?
So actually one of the things that interests me the most are like inner body sounds at the moment, especially in the guts, because I mean, you said this before, it's also a little bit about giving up control, so to say, not having everything in an overview.
Right.
And this is also part of improvisation, right? To not have everything planned and controlled. And for example, like inner body sounds especially, you know, I can control what I chew, but I cannot control what my
what your digestive system
what my
does,
stomach does. And this is super fascinating because without it, I would I would not be able to survive.
Right.
And you know, this also fits to my interest that I have in general about this term that Alexa Shotwell, she's a philosopher, said defensive individualism. And this is like, she tries to explain like Western thinking, in this defensive individualism way. Let it be on a single body, let it be on a city, or let it be, for example, on Europe, like as the fortress Europe is. That this is just an illusion. She say like purity is an illusion. And this is what I refer to when I say I'm very interested in, what is happening there in a body or in different bodies that we cannot control, that I cannot know, for example. And this is something I'm very interested in. And as you said, I don't know how exactly, but I would love also to, engage more with the audience or get in contact with the audience more. Because what I did now is like just coming close to them or something. So this was very one-sided. And thinking about how we can make this a little bit more open, maybe also give them more agency to this room building. This is something I would like to try out. But therefore we would need another brainstorming session.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, that sounds great. Well, thanks very much for your time and for all of your thoughts. We'll be sure to include in the show notes the links to, you mentioned a few people and some books. We can also include some links to some video recordings so people can get an idea of what that movement actually looked like. But now we're going to play a recording of our last performance that includes the echo-somatic practices in the readings. So up next, we'll be able to hear a recording of that. And thanks so much. And I can't wait to see and hear and feel what comes next.
Thank you so much, Steve. Find a comfortable position, whatever that means for you in this particular moment. You could sit down, stand, walk, or even lie down. You can also close your eyes if you want to. If you feel an inclination to move, however small it may be, then don't fight it. You can introduce small movements that feel fluid, effortless, movements that give you a sensation of pleasure. This will look different on each and everybody. Try to let these movements flow. Give in to that urge if it arises, and observe. Now try to conceive of your body as a solid skeletal structure with various joints, surrounded and held together by flesh, made up of tissues with different textures, muscles, soft connective tissues, and fat, stringy tendons. Most of that is covered by a layer of skin, your largest organ. In some places, hair might be sprouting from your skin. It produces oil and sweat. In some places more than in others. There might be scars that have a different texture. Lumps and bumps, hardness in between softness. In some places, your skin might be thicker or thinner. At the end of your fingers and toes, solid nails emerge. There are so many details you can perceive. Take your time. Feel free to touch, squeeze, or caress this body of yours if you feel like it. Take some time for that and be gentle. You are an object among other objects. Let that sink in. How does that feel? However, being an object doesn't mean you are static or unchanging. You are in a constant state of becoming. Different textures and materialities are coming together and shape this entity that you are and its stories. If that is comfortable, try to become aware of the internal movements that run throughout your body. You could focus on a particular sensation, like your breath or your heartbeat, and how it reverberates through your body. Even if you are seemingly still, you can observe infinite internal movements as well as ongoing metabolic processes that keep you alive. Your breath flowing gently, your heart pumping blood through your veins and arteries, your digestive organs working to provide you with energy, the tension in some of your muscles. Become aware of the effort that it takes to be still. Become aware of stillness as an action.
Okay, thanks for listening. Check out the show notes for links to books and ideas mentioned by Lisa and Erbse, the data sources used in the performance, along with videos of the different performance versions. Be sure to sign up for our email list at sustain.fm, follow us on Instagram, also at sustain.fm, and check out our brand new YouTube channel for live performances online, also sustain.fm. See you in 24 for our next episode.